Hi, I'm Dan Willett. I'm the professor of oboe in the MU School of Music, and I'm here today to play for you and discuss some of the pertinent details having to do with this year's audition material. This is years 2021-22, also known as Set 2 in our rotation. So hopefully these will be helpful tips for you as you're practicing and preparing for your auditions. And I would like to say that if you have further questions that I've not touched on today or need further input, feel free to contact me at any time. My contact information is on our MU School of Music website. I'd be delighted to hear from you, answer any questions, hear you play the music, or whatever would be helpful for you. Just let me know. The first etude I'm going to talk about is the long one. It's the Heinze D minor etude, and this is from the Selected Studies, of course, page 8. And there are a couple of major points I'd like to make. Number one is a very general one, which applies to anything you're working on. So make this part of your routine if you haven't already. Use your tuner and your metronome constantly, okay? They are your best friends musically in terms of training because they are brutally honest, right? They never soft pedal the truth for you. They tell you exactly where you stand with your pitch, with your tempo. So use your tuner and your metronome. I've been playing for many, many years. I still use my tuner and metronome a lot because we so easily go astray and drift in our perception of pitch and time. So use those tools. They're wonderful techniques. Okay, the first point I'd like to make is having to do with tempo. A challenge for a piece such as this is the fact that it has note values from dotted half note to 30-second notes. And we need to find a tempo that facilitates both. It's marked andante, which is sort of a mid-range tempo, but it needs to have a sense of motion. Many of you heard the tradition of andante as a walking pace. So it has to have a sense of motion to it. More practically speaking, it needs to be slow enough that your fastest note values don't sound panicked, right? The 30-second notes here. But it needs to be fast enough so that it doesn't die on the long notes, or that you don't die playing those long phrases. For me, a kind of a happy medium tempo is about eighth note equals 84 or so. So try around in that range. And then once you've found that tempo, here's where your metronome comes in to play, and that is you play with your metronome so that you make sure in places such as the opening where you're tempted to play a little faster to get through the phrases, hold it back to that tempo so that when you arrive at the faster note values, you don't have to slow your tempo down, okay? So consistent tempo throughout. Keep in mind that good time and lyrical phrasing are not mutually exclusive. We can play with a consistent tempo and make music and phrases at the same time. Now, of course, there are places to stretch a little bit for musical reasons. Absolutely, you can stretch, but after you stretch, get back, resume the same tempo. Don't suddenly change tempos or break the tempo entirely, okay? So be true to the rhythm, find a good tempo, keep it consistent throughout with flexible moments here and there. Breathing, that's a challenge here because when you're counting in eighth notes, you end up with some pretty long phrases. So when you reach a cadence point, such as the end of the 1, 2, 3, fourth measure, you've got that dotted half note, feel free to shorten that a lot. As long as you end it nicely and make it sound purposeful, you can make quite a space there to give yourself a chance to breathe. Okay, and of course on oboe we need to breathe out before we breathe in to avoid that cumulative packed lung feeling. So there, the end of 4. And by the way, I'd push pause now. If you'd like to on the comments, go number your measures because I'll be using measure numbers as I'm working through here. Okay, so that's the end of measure 4. The same thing at the end of measure 13, that high A there as well. There's one other place where you can create a rest, and that's at the end of measure 27. You have a written in retard, 30-second notes to triplet 16ths, then to 16th notes. Many people actually add a little retard at the end of that and then make a break before jumping into measure 28. And that musically works perfectly fine. And so on and so forth. So feel free to do that. As long as you make it sound purposeful and make it musically palatable, you can do something like that to actually add a rest. So tempo and breathing spots. And then another point I would like to make is concerning dots on notes. I know it's very easy for us to look at a note with a dot on it and think, oh, that's got to be short, and to end up with all kinds of pecky short notes. Well, I wouldn't think of a dot on a note as necessarily short, okay? Especially music written in prior times. Heinze goes back quite a few years, and at that time in history, I would say a dot meant mostly that it was articulated clearly, okay? Perhaps a little bit of space, but not necessarily pecky. So for instance, in measure 18 and 19, we have these eighth notes with dots on them. Yes, a little space is good. Okay, there's a little bit of space, but still left over is a note that has a fairly good length to it. So for instance, let me do it a bad way, which is pecky. No, right? That just makes no sense at all. So some length with a little space around it is good. And you'll notice I actually breathed in there. So you have a chance to alternate out, in breaths in separate places and still have some length there, okay? So keep in mind the length of a dot on a note doesn't necessarily mean short or certainly not pecky in a piece like this. A little space, but still some length. An even more vivid example is measure 26, where we have these constant 30-second notes. And you'll notice there are two things going on. You have repeated 30-second notes below, A and G sharp, and then the first note of each group create a melody with themselves. It's really a compound melody. So, I ask you, which is more important? Is that more important, or is that clearly is where the melody is, okay? So to practice, leave out the fast notes and just play like I did, or even slur it. Okay, there's the melody. Now add the other stuff in, but instead of playing a short note, think as long as you possibly can make those melodic 30-second notes and still basically keep the time. I'll stretch maybe for the first one or two, but definitely not pecky. As opposed to, terrible, right? So again, be careful how you interpret dots. They don't necessarily mean short. In a case like this, I'd say play as long as you can possibly make them within those short time values there. One further point I'd like to make here is in the last line. Measure 31 to the end of the piece. It's marked piano, and then 3 measures later, you have a diminuendo, okay? If you take that literally, you're gonna be ending up at an excruciatingly soft level. So start piano a little bit, a high on the piano side. And I'd find it's helpful to cheat back on the trill a little bit. Let the trill grow, bring you up a little bit so you have a little more space to actually diminuendo, and then really don't diminuendo completely until the very last note of the piece, okay? Don't play too close to the edge of the cliff as an oboe player, or we're gonna fall off, okay? So take that piano with a grain of salt in the last line to create a little more safety as you finish the piece. Okay, Rubank number 5, of course, is one of the progressive melodies from the Barrett oboe method. It also appears in the Geckler oboe method book 2, so widely used as a melody. if you're familiar, if you've played it in one of those other two publications, you'll notice that there are perhaps some details that are a little different, some articulations, a couple little dynamic markings here. Just to keep us all on the same page, I'd say do it as it's printed in the Rubank book, so we're all being consistent with us. This, of the 40 Barrett progressive melodies, is one of my favorites. I really like this. I think it's number 3 of the original 40. And the reason is it's such an emotionally packed little piece. There's space for all sorts of drama within this. And so I'd say that is the biggest challenge to really set your apart on, is to see how much drama, how much emotion you can put into this piece. Of course, it needs to be in time. Use your metronome, your tuner, do all of those things, but get all the notes in the right place, all the articulations and such, but then see how much drama you can create in here. The emotions, dark melancholy, there's pain, there's crying out, there's consolation, there's weeping, all those emotions that are perfectly suited for the oboe. And our moments in the orchestral repertoire call for us to depict those those emotions so much, and that's the case here. So there's dotted rhythms here, even over dotting. As much as drama and rhythmic snap as you can get in there. And then in measure 20, when it goes up to that high C, that's really the culmination of the piece. And at that point, it should really be crying out in pain and anguish, or whatever that is. And then pickups to measure 23, back to piano again. It's a recap. After all the outcry and everything prior to that, it ends and just whimpers quietly into the corner. Smorzando, dying away. As you're emotionally wrung out, you're just fading off the page at that point. So as much as you can do. Now, in the glimpse of that darkness and crying and pain and anguish, there is a moment in the middle of where it's in sunny C major. But that doesn't last very long. A couple measures later, we're back into A minor once more. So as much drama as you can pour into this thing. There are two common pitfalls I'd like to point out. The most common mistakes I hear in this piece. The first one is in measure 8. It's waiting, holding that half note F and waiting right to beat 4 all the way up to beat 4 to begin the 16th note. So lots of people are prone to step in early on that. So wait all the way up to beat 4 for the 16th notes, and then winding down to slower note values from 16ths into the 8th notes in the next measure, and then slipping the turn in time. So keeping the tempo consistent through those measures as the tempo slows down. Okay, work it out with the metronome, work out the little details, keep a constant tempo throughout all of that busyness there. And then a second one is a real kind of easy one to miss. In the recap, in measure 24, in what is otherwise precise duplication of the original melody, notice the rhythm is different in measure 24. Way back at the top of the piece in the second complete measure, in measure 24, it's twice as fast. Lots of people will play it the same way twice, so don't fall for that one, okay? So enjoy it, make as much music out of this as you possibly can. Okay, for English horn, I'd make all the same general comments as I did for oboe on both of these etudes, but a couple of things pertaining specifically to English horn I would comment on here. One has to do with fingerings. If on your English horn the high D is flat, then you can use a slightly different fingering. So whereas normally for high D we would finger half hold 2, 3, low C, possibly the middle key for tuning. On my English horn and many, that comes out very flat. If that's the case, another way you can finger high D, left hand stays the same, but instead of low C key, play it with the third finger and the C sharp key, and you can hear the difference. Hear the difference between the octave there. So substitute that high C sharp as well. You can play a little different fingering there. There's our normal C sharp fingering, which comes out very flat on mine. Almost a seventh. So again, for English horn, you can finger C sharp, half hold 2, 3, 1 and 3, like a forked F, and C sharp. A lot better octave there. And of course, if you finger C sharp that way, then all you do is lift that finger for D. So try those out with a tuner and see if those fingerings work for you. The other general comment I would make has to do with breathing. Of course, English horn takes a little more volume of air. So the good news is that you have less of the issue of backed up, bottled up air to get rid of, but you do need to be prepared to take a little bit more quantity than on oboe. So make your adjustments accordingly. If you're preparing oboe and English horn both, which I'd recommend you do, is to just be aware that the breathing may involve a little bit of tweaking in that sense. So I hope these comments and thoughts are helpful for you. If anything is confusing that I've said, or if you have any other questions or would like feedback, absolutely feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear from you, answer questions you have. If you'd like to get together, meet, I would be happy to hear you play through these, work on you with them. My contact information is on our School of Music website. So please contact me. I would love to hear you. Good luck.